For all you philosophers out there, how we perceive and experience the world, that's your bread and butter, right? Well, today we're taking a deep dive into a sense that might seem pretty basic at first glance, but trust me, it's a philosophical rabbit hole. Touch.
I'm intrigued already.
So you shared this incredible resource with me, an entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, really in-depth stuff. And what we're going to do today is, well, unpack it. Pull out the most interesting arguments, the thought-provoking bits, and kind of see it all through that philosophical lens you bring to the table.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about vision when we talk about perception. But touch, it's almost like this hidden world of interconnected ideas, and it's essential if we want to understand how we experience reality, what it means to actually be in the world. So where do we even begin? Well, the entry makes a point right off the bat that's pretty interesting. Touch is kind of overshadowed by vision in a lot of these discussions, but it's a central part of how we perceive things, and it's one of the first senses to develop, which is remarkable in itself.
Right.
And then there's this fact that it's not just localized like vision in the eyes or hearing in the ears. It spans our entire body, this whole network of different receptors. That already hints at something way more complex than we might initially think.
Yeah, it's not just one spot, one organ. It's like, well, it makes you wonder if the sense of touch is even the right way to think about it. I mean, does that term really capture it?
Yeah, it's almost like our language, how we normally talk about touch, maybe it's oversimplifying something much more intricate. So let's dive into this idea. Why might the sense of touch actually be kind of a misnomer?
Okay, so we tend to categorize our senses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. Neat little boxes.
Yeah, it makes it tidy.
But touch, it kind of pushes back against that. It doesn't fit neatly.
Yeah.
The entry does a good job of breaking down the terms, getting specific. Like active touch, that's when we're moving, exploring with our hands. Or haptic, same idea.
Okay.
Then there's tactile or cutaneous. That's more about the skin itself, what's happening right at the surface. And tactual, that's the big umbrella term covering everything.
So tactual is the broadest. Got it.
And then there's tangible. That's about the properties we can actually perceive through touch, the qualities,
Okay, so it's not as straightforward as an eye for vision, an ear for hearing, right?
No, not at all. It's not just one organ, one dedicated thing. The skin, it's this vast, complex organ, and it's home to all sorts of sensory systems.
So what's that mean for our understanding of touch?
Well, for a philosopher, it raises some really interesting questions about how they don't really feel like touch, do they? You wouldn't say, oh, I'm touching that sharp pain.
No, it feels different.
Exactly. And that already muddies the waters a bit, doesn't it?
It does. And even when we focus on those senses, those systems that do feel more traditionally like touch, there's still this incredible variety, all these sensory channels working together. I mean, the overview even mentions that researchers are still figuring out the basic types of receptors involved.
It's true. We're still learning about the underlying physiology. It's complex.
So to bring it back to the philosophical side, with all this diversity, how do we define touch then? How do we create a definition that encompasses everything it is while still distinguishing it from all these other senses we experience?
It's a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Radcliffe, the philosopher mentioned in the entry, he makes a pretty bold claim. Maybe the sheer variety of touch means we can't have one single unifying definition.
Wow, okay, that's interesting. And here's something that really stuck out to me as I was reading this. The overview points out that the pathways for those thermal sensations, hot and cold, they're more similar to the pathways for pain and itch than they are to the pathways for pressure, shape, those things.
Yeah.
But we usually group hot and cold with touch, but pain is separate. How do we make sense of that? Seems kind of arbitrary, doesn't it?
It does, right. And it makes you question, what's the basis for our sensory categories? Is it physiology? Is it the type of information our brain gets? Or is it something else entirely? And then there's haptic touch. We were talking about that earlier. That involves receptors in muscles, joints, tendons, not just the skin. So it's not even all about the skin in the first place.
It's much more than that.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think it's safe to say that thinking of touch as just this one thing like vision or hearing, well, it's not quite accurate.
Right. It makes sense then that a lot of cognitive scientists are saying that touch is inherently multisensory, not just a single sense.
Yeah, you see researchers like Loomis and Letterman, Gallus and Spence, Linden, they all emphasize how touch comes from the integration of all these different sensory inputs. And it's also about the feedback we get from our own movements.
So how does this all play into the philosophical problem of, individuating the senses? How do we define and separate them in the first place?
Good question.
Aristotle, he had this idea of a proper sensible, a feature that's unique to each sense. Like color, that's the proper sensible for vision. So what's the proper sensible for touch? Pressure, temperature.
Well, there's the problem, right? They're not exclusive to touch. You can feel pressure with your muscles when you're lifting weights. You can sense temperature changes in the air without direct contact. It doesn't fit neatly into those categories.
Right. And Aristotle's idea was that each sense had its own distinct object. And if touch doesn't have this one specific proper sensible,
It throws a wrench in the whole framework. Maybe we need a new way to understand how we categorize sensory experience.
the overview goes through some other more recent philosophical takes on this. Keeley, for instance, sees senses as specialized informational channels.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, touch would actually be multiple modalities because we have separate channels for different types of stimuli like pressure and temperature, almost like a bunch of mini senses within touch itself.
That's one way to think about it. Focus on the neural pathways, the specific information they're carrying, mechanoreception, thermoreception. They all evolve separately. They all have different jobs.
Okay. Then there's Nuds, who suggests that sensory modalities are more like conventions. They're defined by what we learn through experience. So touch, then, would be unified by the fact that it's how we come to know things like weight, texture, temperature. It's about the kind of knowledge we get.
Yeah, that shifts the focus, doesn't it? It's less about the physical mechanisms and more about the phenomenal experience, what it's like to encounter those tangible qualities and what we learn about the world from them.
And then there's McPherson, who proposes this really interesting multidimensional space for classifying senses. So it takes into account not just the organs involved, but also the type of information, the type of experience, the way it feels. And if we use that model, touch ends up taking up a much larger space than other senses. It really highlights how diverse it is.
Yeah, it shows how touch might be fundamentally different from something like vision or smell. It covers a much wider range of experiences, involves different parts of the body, integrates with our actions in different ways.
And finally, there's Fulkerson's binding thesis. The idea here is that the unity of touch doesn't come from one single thing, but from the way all these different systems work together to connect different sensory features in our experience. It's the cooperation that makes it feel whole.
Like a team effort. Each player has its role, but they work together to achieve the goal.
Okay, so defining touch itself is a philosophical puzzle. But how about how it interacts with other senses, especially vision? That's been a big topic in philosophy, right?
Oh, for sure. Vision and touch, they both give us crucial information about objects, their shapes, sizes, where they are in space, but they do it in very different ways.
And this brings us to a classic philosophical problem, Molyneux's problem.
Oh, right, the thought experiment.
Imagine someone blind from birth who suddenly gains sight. Would they be able to immediately recognize a cube and a sphere just by looking at them, if they only knew those shapes by touch before? It's all about how spatial information might be represented and whether it can be transferred between senses.
It really gets at the heart of the issue. Are touch and vision using the same spatial language, or are they fundamentally different?
Right. And the entry cites a lot of research on this. Evans, Campbell, Hopkins, Ferretti, and Glennon, even Cohn and Mathen. It's clearly a question that's still relevant and important.
Definitely. It makes you question the nature of spatial awareness itself. How do different senses create their own representations of space, and how are those representations connected?
And even beyond Molyneux's problem, the overview points out some key differences in how we experience space through touch and vision. With vision, you get this wide field. You can see empty space, potential for objects. But touch, it's more like hearing in that way. It seems tied to specific objects in contact with the body.
Yeah, touch and hearing are about what's actually present, what's interacting with us directly, while vision gives us this broader sense of the surrounding environment.
And then there's the connection between touch and our own actions in the world. It feels much stronger than with vision, doesn't it? Because touch so often involves actively exploring with our hands, our bodies.
You have that sense of resistance when you touch something solid. It's like you're pushing against the world and it's pushing back.
It gives you this real feeling of being engaged with reality, maybe more so than with vision, which can feel more passive in a way.
Philosophers like Smith have argued that this active nature of touch might give it a stronger epistemic foundation. Like it connects us more directly to the reality of the external world.
The entry also mentions a point that's really interesting. It says touch might not actually provide us with a full 3D experience of space in the same way vision does. Our tactile experience is kind of limited to the surface of our bodies. We can't feel what's behind us without turning around, for example.
It's a fascinating constraint. Our tactile field is inherently bound to our physical form.
It's like we're always centered in our own tactile world, even as we reach out and explore.
Right, it makes our tactile experience of space quite different from the expansiveness of our visual field.
And this leads us to the template view, which suggests that we can only experience touch out there in the world because we have this underlying awareness of our own body as the thing doing the touching.
O'Shaughnessy was a big proponent of that view. He saw a fundamental dependence of our perception of external touch on our awareness of our own bodily posture, our internal sense of our body in space.
Though the entry also mentions Scott, who has offered some counterexamples, situations where we seem to perceive through touch without that direct, conscious bodily awareness.
Like a quick reflex, where you're not really thinking about your body, but you're still reacting to a tactile stimulus.
Right, so maybe it's not as absolute as the template view suggests, but it seems like bodily awareness still plays a significant role in how we experience touch.
Definitely. It's hard to imagine touch without some sense of our own body as the reference point.
Now let's talk about tangible qualities, things like texture, hardness, those sorts of things. The overview points out something I found surprising. There hasn't been as much philosophical investigation into these qualities as there has been into things like color and vision or sound and hearing. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. Maybe it's because tangible qualities seem so directly tied to the physical properties of objects.
Yeah.
Like a rough surface just is rough, a hard object just is hard. It doesn't feel as mysterious as the subjective experience of color, for example.
Right. But there have been some attempts to analyze these qualities. Armstrong, for example, had this reductionist view where he tried to break down most tangible qualities, except for hot and cold, into spatial properties.
So a rough surface, for Armstrong, would be one with a certain kind of uneven shape at a microscopic level. Hardness would be about how resistant an object is to changes in its shape.
He even distinguished between these transitive sensations that tell us about the external world and intransitive ones that are more about internal bodily states, like pains or itches.
It was a bold attempt to ground tangible qualities in something more fundamental, something purely spatial.
But as the entry points out, some of those reductions can feel a bit forced, like they don't quite capture the full experience of these qualities.
Trying to reduce everything to shapes and positions, it can lose some of the richness of our tactile experience.
Then there's Fulkerson, who offers a different perspective. He suggests that tangible qualities are more like intensive features that vary along a single dimension, like the frequency of a vibration.
So instead of thinking about roughness as a specific shape, it's more like a quality that increases or decreases along a spectrum. More intense vibration, rougher feeling, less intense, smoother feeling.
That seems to fit better with how we actually experience those qualities, doesn't it?
It does, and it aligns well with how our sensory receptors work. They fire at different rates depending on the intensity of the stimulus.
But again, hot and cold seem to be the exceptions. They don't fit neatly into either the spatial reduction or the single dimension model. They vary in two directions, hot and cold, and they're very much influenced by our own body temperature.
Temperature is tricky. It's a real challenge to those simpler accounts of tangible qualities.
Speaking of tricky, let's dive into thermal awareness. The overview really highlights how our experience of hot and cold doesn't always match up with the actual objective temperature of things.
That's right. We have this neutral zone where things feel neither hot nor cold, and then things get hotter or colder from there. It's not a simple linear scale like objective temperature.
It's like our experience of temperature has its own internal logic that's different from the physics of heat.
And that's been a big focus in the philosophy of perception. How do we reconcile this subjective experience of temperature with the objective reality of heat?
And this is where the idea of secondary qualities comes in. Maybe hot and cold don't actually exist out in the world as we experience them. Maybe they're just how we perceive different degrees of molecular motion.
So hot and cold are more about our sensory response to that underlying physical reality than about properties inherent to the objects themselves.
The classic example of the two hands in water, one hot, one cold, and then both in lukewarm water.
Right, and they feel completely different temperatures even though the water is the same.
It's a great illustration of how much our own internal state influences our experience of temperature.
It shows how subjective those qualities are. And it's led some philosophers to argue that our sensory systems might not just be about giving us objective information about the world.
So what else could they be doing?
Well, they could be giving us information about our own bodies, about our internal state. Like, why does metal feel colder than wood at the same temperature?
Yeah, why is that?
Because metal conducts heat away from our skin faster. It changes our internal state more quickly. So our experience of coldness is as much about how our body is reacting as it is about the actual temperature of the metal.
Makes sense. And there's Gray, who argues that we should think of temperature and pressure as fundamentally different senses because of how information can be transmitted.
Right.
Like you can extend your sense of pressure with a tool, but you can't really do that with temperature.
Yeah, that's a compelling point.
Yeah.
You can feel the shape of something with a stick, but you can't feel its temperature that way. It suggests there's something deeper, some underlying difference in how those two senses work.
Okay, let's move on to something that's always fascinated me. The connection between touch and bodily awareness. It seems like a much stronger connection than with our other senses, wouldn't you say?
I agree. It's almost like touch is inseparable from our sense of our own body.
And the overview even suggests that touch might always involve proprioception, that sense of where our body parts are in space. So when we touch something, we're not just aware of the object, we're aware of our hand, our arm, the part of us that's doing the touching.
O'Shaughnessy and Ratcliffe have both argued for this close link between touch and proprioception. They see it as fundamental to how tactile experience works.
And then there are thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, Gibson, Martin. They all really emphasize the body as the measure of things in touch. It's like our own physicality provides the framework for understanding what we feel.
They highlight how embodied touch is. Our experience of size, shape, texture, it all relates back to our body, to our own capabilities for movement and interaction.
But the overview also mentions some counterexamples, times when we seem to have tactile awareness without that direct conscious awareness of our body, like a skilled athlete reacting to a ball without having to think about it.
Right, those quick reflexes. In those cases, maybe the bodily awareness is there, but it's more implicit. It's not what we're consciously focusing on.
Interesting. And then there's Mattins, who proposes a completely different way of looking at it. He says we might be overemphasizing the role of touch in perceiving external objects.
What does he think its primary role is then?
He calls it the bodyguard hypothesis. He thinks the main function of touch is actually protective signaling, letting us know about potential threats and keeping us aware of our own body. Perceiving external objects is secondary.
So it's more about self-preservation than exploration, at least from an evolutionary perspective.
And Richardson, he argues that bodily sensation is necessary for any kind of touch perception to happen. But it doesn't have to be a direct spatial match like in the template view.
So you don't have to feel something on your hand to perceive it with a tool held in your hand.
Mm-hmm.
It's a more flexible view that can accommodate things like extended touch.
Then there's Mizrahi, who has this really intriguing idea. He says our body is actually the medium of touch, not just the instrument. Yeah, so it shapes how objects feel to us without us directly experiencing the body itself. It's like the lens through which we perceive the tactile world.
It's shaping the experience without being the object of the experience itself.
Exactly. And then when we talk about extended touch using tools, it gets even more complex. How does our brain integrate the feeling of the tool in our hand with the information coming from the object at the end of the tool?
That's where the informational dependence view comes in. The idea is that our perception of that distant object is actually based on the sensory input we're getting from our hand and our awareness of how we're moving the tool.
So it's a combination of tactile input and motor control.
It's a really sophisticated integration of different systems, and it highlights how active touch really is. It's not just passive reception.
And finally, there's this distinction between interoception, our sense of our internal body state, and exteroception, our sense of the external world.
Right, what's happening inside versus what's happening outside.
And this makes you wonder if some of what we call touch might actually be more interoceptive, like feeling feverish or itchy. Those sensations might be more about our internal state than about anything external.
Yeah, it blurs the lines a bit. And it emphasizes how diverse the category of touch really is. It's not just about perceiving external objects. It's also about monitoring our own bodies, maintaining a sense of internal balance.
Okay, let's talk about action. The overview makes a distinction between passive touch, just feeling something on your skin, and active touch, where we're moving and exploring with our hands, our bodies.
It's a key distinction. Passive touch is more basic. It gives us information. But active touch, that's where we really engage with the world, where we manipulate things and learn about their properties in detail.
Early research on touch often focused on the passive side, measuring things like the 2-point discrimination threshold. How close can 2 points be on your skin before you feel them as one?
Yeah, and those studies showed us that tactile acuity varies across the body. Some areas are much more sensitive than others.
But our everyday experience of touch is much more active than that. It involves our whole body, specialized movements, different kinds of grips.
It's a dynamic process. We hold things, we manipulate them, we explore them with our hands. And all of that movement gives us information that goes beyond just simple contact.
It's not just about what we're touching, but how we're touching it.
Exactly. And then there's stereognosis, being able to recognize objects just by touch. That requires a really sophisticated integration of tactile information and motor control.
Gibson talked about this extended haptic system, the idea that our whole body, including our motor systems, is involved in actively perceiving the world through touch.
It's a very different way of thinking about touch than the old idea of passive receptors just sending signals to the brain. For Gibson, touch is about active engagement with the environment.
And we see this in things like dynamic touch, where you can determine the size and shape of an object just by hefting it, moving it around in your hand.
The way an object feels as you manipulate it gives you information about its weight, its balance, its center of gravity. It's a different kind of information than you get from just holding it still.
And this all connects to broader theories of active perception, like in activism and embodied cognition. The idea that our actions, our embodiment, are fundamentally intertwined with how we perceive the world.
Touch provides strong support for those theories. It's a clear example of how our bodies aren't just passive receivers of information, but active participants in shaping our experience.
So, philosophically, what does this tell us about the relationship between action and touch? Is action just a necessary cause for touch perception, or is it something more? Is it somehow constitutive of touch itself?
That's a big question, a deep one. Does the act of moving, of exploring, actually define what it means to experience something through touch? It makes you rethink the very nature of tactile perception and its connection to our agency in the world.
Now, let's move on to something that's gaining more attention in philosophy these days. The role of pleasure in touch, and more broadly, the role of affect, both pleasant and unpleasant feelings in our perception.
It's an important shift, moving beyond a purely information-based view of the senses, recognizing that our feelings, our emotions, play a role in how we perceive the world.
And touch is a great place to study this because it's so rich with affective qualities. Think about the difference between a gentle caress and a sharp poke.
Absolutely. And then there's the discovery of CT afferents, those nerve fibers that seem to be specifically tuned to pleasant touch.
It's almost like there's a dedicated pathway in our nervous system for experiencing pleasurable touch sensations.
It's a fascinating finding, and it raises so many questions. How can a nerve fiber code for pleasantness? Are there similar fibers in other parts of the skin? And what does this mean for our understanding of pleasure more generally?
It makes you wonder if this CT system is even really part of touch as we traditionally think of it. I mean, it doesn't seem to be involved in discriminating objects or telling us about their spatial properties.
It's possible that it represents a separate affective modality that overlaps with touch. Or maybe it's an integral part of touch, but with a very specific function. It challenges our assumptions about how the senses are organized.
And the way these CT efferents interact with our emotions and motivations, it really highlights the interconnectedness of our inner lives and our perceptual experiences.
Pleasant touch isn't just a sensation. It's linked to things like social bonding, caregiving, feelings of comfort, and well-being. It's a powerful force in our lives.
And Korsmeyer's work on the aesthetics of touch brings in another dimension. He talks about how touch can give objects a sense of authenticity, of value, that you don't get from just looking at them. It's like touch connects us to objects in a more direct, more intimate way.
That's especially relevant in the context of art, where touch can be a key part of the experience. You're not just observing the artwork, you're interacting with it, feeling its texture, its weight, its presence.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but I think it's clear that touch, far from being a simple sense, is a complex and philosophically rich area of inquiry.
Absolutely. From its very definition to its relationship with other senses, its connection to our body, its role in action and effect, touch raises all sorts of fundamental questions about how we perceive the world, how we understand our own embodiment, and what it means to be a sensing, feeling, acting being in the world.
And we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore.
I'm sure there are many more discoveries waiting to be made, both in neuroscience and in philosophy.
Given how fundamental touch is, how it connects us to our own bodies and to the world around us, do you think it might play an even more central role in shaping our sense of self and our understanding of reality than we typically acknowledge? I mean, we tend to prioritize vision so much, but maybe touch is actually more foundational in a way.
That's a really thought-provoking question. The fact that touch is always with us, it's distributed across our entire body, it's so intimately tied to our actions. It does suggest that it might be more fundamental to our experience of being in the world than those senses that operate at a distance. It's a challenge to our usual way of thinking about perception, and it opens up a lot of exciting possibilities for future exploration.
This deep dive into the philosophy of touch has been fascinating, and I hope it's inspired some new thinking about this often overlooked sense. Thanks for joining me on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, see you then.